Hello everyone, welcome to session 1 of module 4, the test development process. In this session, we will learn about the test development process. So let's first discuss about what we will cover in whole module 4. So module 4 is test design techniques, and in test design techniques we will cover the test development process, which we'll cover in this session. Then in second session we will cover what are the categories of test design techniques. Then in third session we will cover black box test design techniques, which are also known as specification based test design techniques. In fourth session we will cover structure based or white box test design techniques. In fifth session we will cover experience based test design techniques. And finally in sixth session we will cover how to choose the best test design technique for your testing activity. So let's get started with session 1, the test development process. So why is test development process important, or why do you want to go through all the test development and prepare all different kind of test documentation before you can actually start testing? It is important because you cannot just go ahead and do any sort of random testing without having any sort of goal or plan what you want to achieve with that testing. So you should be very clear when you are starting any testing activity. You should be very clear what you want to achieve from that testing. So you should be clear what you want to test, what inputs are required to test that thing, and what outcome or what expected result you are expecting from those inputs. So in this session you will learn about test conditions, which are documented in test design specification documentation. Then you will learn about test cases, which are documented in test case specification document. And finally test procedures, which are documented in test procedure document. So before we proceed further, let's understand what these different terms, test conditions, test cases, and test procedure mean. So test condition is anything in a software that can be tested. In a simplest term, anything that you can test in a software or system is a test condition. If you talk about ISTQB definition of test condition, it is an item or event of a component or system that could be verified by one or more test cases. It can be a function, it can be a transaction, it can be any quality attribute of a software, any feature. So suppose you are testing an e-commerce website. So your test condition for that can be user verify that user is able to log in successfully, verify that user is able to do the payment successfully using the payment gateway or payment functionality of an e-commerce website, in the most high level kind of definition, whatever you want to achieve. In a more granular terms, suppose your payment gateway accepts different kind of payment types like Visa, MasterCard, or American Express, or any other bank cards, any other different types of cards. So your test condition will be Visa, MasterCard, American Express. So these are different conditions that you will be combining together with different kind of inputs, which will form the test cases, and you will test those. So test condition is any process or any quality attribute or any transaction. So transaction suppose you should be able to log in successfully in an e-commerce website. You should be able to log out successfully. You should not be able to log in with invalid username and password. These are simple transactions. Then quality attributes or feature could be that your when you add any items to the cart, items should get added to the cart successfully. When you remove items to the cart, items should get removed successfully. Right? So these are some of the things that you can think of high level, which can be tested in an e-commerce website. For the payment gateway, you can have granular things. You need to test with Visa, you need to test with MasterCard, you need to test with American Express card. So these are some of the test conditions which you need to decide, think of, and document in test design specification document. Then after you finalize these test conditions, you need to define the test cases. So test case is a document which contains input conditions, what input you are trying to provide, and the expected outcome for those input. So it's a document which tests your one or more test conditions. And then test procedures is the document in which you define the procedure, the actual procedure, step by step process which will be required to execute the whole flow. So suppose you are testing end-to-end flow of an e-commerce website. So a procedure could be step 1, login to the e-commerce website using valid login credentials, and then you mention the test case identifier for that step 1 thing. So a person will follow that test case identifier for the step 1 to prepare before he actually goes ahead and test the actual functionality. So suppose you are testing add to cart functionality. So before doing add to cart, you have number of steps. You need to log into the e-commerce portal, you need to search for the product, and then click on add to cart button, and then it will be added to cart. So a test procedure, a document will clarify what steps you need to follow before you actually test the functionality. It's kind of preparing preparation before you actually go ahead and test the add to cart functionality. So similarly, if you take a database example, you want to search some user on the website. So how will that user be available on the website? You want to test the search functionality on the website. So before doing any search functionality, before testing any search functionality of the user on the website, on the e-commerce website, that user should be existing in the database. So a test procedure document will explain the tester to set up that user first in the database before going ahead and testing the search functionality of an e-commerce website. So the test procedure document will say step 1, follow test case, whatever test case has been written for adding a user in the database. So follow test case adding user to database to add the user in e-commerce database. Second step, log into e-commerce website using test case, login using valid credentials. And then finally he'll go to search box and search for the user that has been added in the database. So that's what test procedures are, that step-by-step definition of what you actually want to test and what preparation is required before you actually go ahead and test that functionality. Now let's understand formality of test documentation. So testing can be performed with varied level of formality. It's not always true that testing has to be done with highest level of formality or the most formal approach. There are many informal approaches to testing as well. So the level of formality for testing can vary. You can have very minimal test documentation before you actually start testing, or you can have extensive documentation for testing. So it could be very informal with minimal documentation, or very formal with extensive test documentation. Then right level of formality depends on context of testing. So as we understood in previous sessions, that formality of testing depends what the context of testing is. Testing is context dependent, which means that if you are testing a safety critical application, that will be tested differently than an e-commerce website or your family website. All right. So similarly, in your formality of test documentation depends on the context. If you're testing a safety critical application, a road safety application, you need to follow a very formal approach as compared to any family website or any application that you are developing for your own, which will be used by only few people. So level of formality is also influenced by the organization, its culture, maturity of development, and testing processes. So level of formality is also dependent on the organization. If organization policy says that whatever you test, you need to follow the formal test documentation process, then every project has to follow that test development process. If the overall organizational policy doesn't have any such definition of formal test documentation, then it's at the discretion of the project to decide what level of formality or maturity of test documentation they want to follow. So in this session, we will cover the most formal approach of test documentation, and then depending on different organizations, they follow their own approaches and level of formality, whichever suits the organization. Now the test development process. So test development is not a single stage activity. It's a process which consists of three main phases. The first phase of test development process is test analysis. Second phase is test design, and finally the test implementation. So let's understand these phases one by one. Test analysis is identifying the test conditions. So as we discussed in previous some previous slides, test condition is anything that can be tested. So test analysis is just an analysis of the test basis and figuring out what can be tested. So the process of looking at the test basis to derive test information is known as test analysis. So test analysis is nothing, it's just you look at the test basis. Test basis is nothing, it can be an existing systems, your requirements documents, your design documents. You go through all the documentation, understand them, and then derive any sort of test information, which is known as test analysis. So test basis is system requirement, SRS design document, any code or any business process that is available before you start the test analysis. So in test analysis, we find out what could be tested or test conditions. Test conditions is something which can be tested. We already discussed this. The test condition is any condition. It can be any um, transaction, it can be any feature like search functionality. So a test condition can be search for an existing user on an e-commerce website, search for a non-existent user on a website. So these are different, test conditions. Search a valid transaction, valid payment gets processed. Search that invalid card gets declined, payment is declined for an invalid card. So these are different transactions which can be noted down as the test conditions. So in test analysis, you find these kind of test conditions. You analyze the system, you analyze the requirement, you analyze the business process to find out these kind of conditions, test conditions which can be tested. So the chosen test condition depend on the test strategy or detailed test approach. For example, they might be based on risk, model of the system, likely failures, compliance requirements, or expert advice. So test condition, whatever you want to choose as a test condition, they depend on different, kind of um, different factors which can be a risk. So suppose you are testing a software in which there are n number of modules. Module A, B, and C are high risk module because they will be used most of the time by the end users. They are high risk module, so your test analysis will focus more on those modules, and you will be figuring out more test conditions for those modules. So your test condition will be is in this scenario, your test condition is based on the risk factor associated with those modules. Then it can be your test condition can be dependent on the expert advice. If expert says these are the modules or these are the scenarios that you need to uh, give more attention to, then your identification of test condition focus more on those areas. So it's dependent on different approaches based on, it can be on risk, model of the system, failures. So if you already know that in the previous release of similar kind of project there were more failures around payment gateway integration, then you will focus more on payment gateway test conditions in the next project. Then the test conditions are then converted into detailed test cases. Test design techniques are used to figure out good set of test cases. So once you do a test analysis, you figure out different test conditions, then those test conditions are converted into detailed test cases, which is second step. Test conditions should be able to be linked back to the source document to identify traceability and requirements coverage. So why is it very important? Test condition, whenever you are writing the test conditions, you should be able to link them back to the requirement, which is known as traceability matrix. Why is traceability matrix very important whenever you are doing any test analysis or design? It is because suppose tomorrow your requirements got modified. So if your test cases or test conditions are traced back to the requirement, you can easily figure out the test cases which you want to modify, which are affected by the modifications in that requirement. So suppose there was requirement A which has 10 test conditions associated with that requirement, and requirement A got modified. You know that you need to modify those 10 test conditions and not search all 500 or 1000 test conditions. All right, so that is why traceability of test conditions is very important. Similarly, during test execution, if you find out that there are 50 test cases that are failing again and again, then you can trace back those 50 test cases to the requirement and see which requirement is affected most because of those test failures. So these are some of the reasons why your traceability matrix is very important during test design process, test development process. Whenever you start the test development process, whatever test conditions you write, whatever test cases you write, it has to be traced back to the test basis or the requirement. Now the second step is the test design step. In the test design, you specify the test cases. So the first step was test analysis, in which you figure out the test conditions. Test condition is anything that can be tested. Then during test design, you create the actual test cases. So during test design, you need to be very specific. You need exact and detailed input conditions, preconditions, and test outcomes. So test case, in test condition, you can have one-liners, you can have any sort of simple testable items in your list, in your test condition document. But in test case is a document which is very specific. You need to have your input condition, what input should be there, what precondition should be required before executing that test condition, and what the test outcome or the expected result is for the test case. So your test case should include input values and test data if any test data is required. So suppose your test case is verify that user is able to log in successfully using valid username and password. So you need to be in your test case, your step 1 will be open e-commerce login URL in whatever browser you want to specify in browser. Then provide valid login details. So your login details is your test data, so you will provide login details in the test data sections. And then expected result would be user should be able to log in successfully. Alright, so your test case should be very specific. What input values should be there, what test data you will put, where you will click on login button, and the expected result should be you should be able to log in successfully and redirect it to home page of e-commerce website. So your test case has more detailed step-by-step definitions there. Expected results should be defined prior to execution. So before you start your test execution, it has to be, your test cases should have expected result there. What you are expecting, what you want to achieve after running that test case. So expected result should be defined in all the test cases. Test cases are prioritized to ensure that high priority test cases are executed first. So in test design itself, you look at the different factors, like risks or expert advice, and then you prioritize your test cases based on the risk factors, the expert advice, and ensure that high priority test cases are always executed first. And test cases need to be detailed. So test procedures or test conditions are not as detailed as the test cases. So test cases need to be in much more detail as compared to test conditions. Now the final step in test development process is the test implementation, or specifying test procedures or scripts. So in test implementation, the test cases are grouped into test suites and ordered into proper sequence. So test implementation is nothing but you prepare test suites and then you order the test cases into proper sequence. So if you're testing a search functionality, you cannot just say that uh, just go directly and execute the search functionality. There are some steps involved before you can actually go ahead and find that search box. So in test implementation, you take care of all those activities. So you group your test cases into test suites like functional test suite, regression test suite, and then you also order into proper sequence. So during test implementation, you also specify the test procedure. Test procedure is a document which specifies the steps to be taken in running a set of tests. It is also referred as test script. So in test implementation, you specify the test procedure. So test procedure, as the name itself is self-explanatory, it's a procedure document. So suppose you want to test a search functionality, a procedure document for testing the search functionality would be execute test case, execute valid login test case, whatever test case number for the valid login user is. Even before that, if that user doesn't exist in the database, so there would be another test case for adding the user in e-commerce database. Otherwise the search for that user will fail. So the step one could be open database, all the steps defined in the test case for adding user in the database. So step one will be execute test case whatever identifier XXX to add user in e-commerce database. Second step, execute test case XYZ login to e-commerce website using valid login credentials. Step 3, go to search text box and search for the added user. Step 4 would be, and the expected result for the step 3 would be, once the user hits search should give the user detail or the user whichever has been added in the database successfully. So test procedures are then formed into test execution schedule or superscript, which specifies which procedures are to be run and by whom. So finally, test procedures are then formed into test execution schedule, which is kind of known as superscript, which has all the details, what steps you need to follow, who has to follow when, and which procedures are to be run at what time and by whom. So there has to be, like timetable to all the high level test superscript and who will be doing what activity. So in test implementation, you specify test procedure or script, and then you also group the test cases into different test suites, functional test suite, regression test suite. So these are all activities involved in test implementation. So if we try to summarize all three processes, test condition, test cases, and test implementation. In test condition, you just figure out what can be tested. Then in test cases, you define the detailed steps how to test that thing, which can test multiple test condition in a test case. And then in test implementation, you group those test cases into functional testing, regression testing, and then you find the test script manual. We formulate manual test script to test something, as I discussed, the search functionality of the user in the e-commerce website database for an admin. So you define in the test implementation, define step-by-step procedure to test something in an e-commerce portal or in any software. To conclude, in this session we learn about the whole test development process and understood about test analysis, test design, and test implementation. In test analysis, we covered test conditions. In test design, how those test conditions are converted into the test cases, into detailed steps, which has precondition, input, and expected output there. And in test implementation, you group all those test cases into logical sequence to test something, and you also form a logical grouping of functional test suite or regression test suite in test implementation. So these are kind of basic standard steps in any test development process: analysis, design, and implementation before you can go ahead and start test execution. Thank you.